In the waning hours of the world's turning, when shadows stretched long across the cobblestones of Caldeum, and the evening bells sang their melancholy hymns, there walked a figure bent beneath the weight of ages. Deckard Cain moved through the city's labyrinthine quarters with the measured pace of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, whose eyes had looked upon wonders and terrors in equal measure. His staff, worn smooth by countless miles and carved with symbols that spoke of forgotten wisdom, clicked against stones that had known the footsteps of scholars and merchants, pilgrims and thieves. Each step carried him deeper into the maze of narrow streets, where shadows pooled like dark water and the scent of jasmine mingled with the distant promise of rain. The great scholar paused beneath a copper dome that caught the last light of the dying sun, its surface reflecting the colors of sunset like molten metal poured across the sky. Here, in this city of learning and commerce, he had come seeking answers to questions that had haunted him across the breadth of sanctuary. The destruction of the World Stone had left the mortal realm vulnerable, its ancient protections shattered like glass beneath the hammer of necessity. Time moved differently for one who had lived through the darkening of Tristram, who had seen the Lord of Terror himself walking among mortals in the guise of a wandering prince. Cain felt the weight of years in his bones, the accumulated sorrows of a lifetime spent in pursuit of truths too terrible for most minds to comprehend. Yet still he walked forward, driven by duty and the faint hope that somewhere in this vast world others carried the flame of the Horadric legacy. The evening air whispered of endings and beginnings, of prophecies stirring to life like ancient embers blown to sudden flame. In the distance, the call to evening prayers echoed from a dozen temples, their voices joining in harmonies that spoke of faith enduring despite the darkness that pressed against the boundaries of the known world. Caldeum rose from the eastern reaches of Kyrgyzstan like a jewel set in desert gold, its towering spires and cascading waterfalls testament to the ambition and ingenuity of those who had shaped it across centuries of careful cultivation. The city served as a crossroads for traders and scholars, a place where knowledge flowed as freely as the precious waters that gave life to its gardens and fountains. Yet beneath the surface beauty, deeper currents moved with purposes their own. The fall of the Zakharum church had sent ripples across the known world, and those displaced by corruption and war had found refuge within Caldeum's walls. Here, the faithful rebuilt their lives while trying to forget the horrors they had witnessed in Kurast's fallen temples. In one of the city's quieter quarters, where the sounds of commerce gave way to the gentler rhythms of domestic life, stood a modest dwelling that harbored secrets weight enough to shake the foundations of the world. Here lived Gillian, once a barmaid in distant Tristram before darkness claimed that town and scattered its survivors to the four winds. The woman who had once brightened the darkest tavern with her smile and laughter had aged beyond her years, her face bearing the marks of sorrows too heavy for any mortal frame to bear. Madness crept through her thoughts like ivy through abandoned ruins, whispering of dangers that others could not perceive, of shadows that moved when no light cast them. With Gillian dwelt a child of 8 summers, Leah, whose dark eyes held depths that seemed to reflect knowledge far beyond her tender years. The girl moved through their small home with the careful grace of one who had learned to sense the shifting moods of those around her, who knew instinctively when to make herself small and silent. Leah knew nothing of her true parentage, Nothing of the witch Adria who had borne her in this very city before disappearing into the wastes on errands known only to herself. The child understood only that Gillian was the closest thing to family she possessed, and that lately the woman who cared for her had begun to speak in whispers of things that made no sense, of demons bathing in blood, of prophecies written in flame across the sky. The nights had grown worse of late. Gillian would pace the narrow halls of their dwelling, muttering to herself in voices that seemed to belong to strangers. Sometimes she would stand at the foot of Leah's bed for hours, swaying slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear, her sightless eyes staring at something beyond the boundaries of the visible world. In the darkness before dawn, when the city lay wrapped in slumber and even the watch dozed at their posts, strange energies stirred within the child's sleeping form. Dreams came to her unbidden, visions of fire and shadow, of creatures with eyes like burning coals moving through landscapes of ash and bone. She would wake with the taste of copper in her mouth and the sound of distant screaming echoing in her ears. Beyond the mountains that ringed Caldeum like a crown of stone, in the forgotten coastal settlement of Gea Kul, a different sort of awakening had taken place. What had begun as scholarly pursuit, as noble intention married to careful research, had twisted into something far more sinister under the influence of powers that delighted in the corruption of good works. The discovery of hidden Horadrim texts in the ruins of an ancient meeting hall had drawn together a collection of learned men who styled themselves the first ones, believing themselves inheritors of a legacy that stretched back to the days when Tyrael himself had walked among mortals. These scholars had approached their studies with the reverence of pilgrims and the careful methodology of true academics. Their leader, Gareth Rao, had seemed the ideal guide for their endeavors. A litterateur well-versed in the arcane arts, possessed of both the knowledge and the charisma necessary to bind disparate individuals into a functioning order. His enthusiasm for their discoveries had proved infectious, his vision of a renewed Horadrim compelling enough to draw men from their comfortable lives into the service of something greater than themselves. Yet even as the first ones delved deeper into their studies, as they sworn oaths to uphold the tenets of the ancient order and pledged themselves to the pursuit of wisdom, darker forces had taken notice of their activities. Belial, the Lord of Lies, had whispered sweetly in Gareth Rao's ear during the quiet hours when the scholar sat alone with texts that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. The corruption had been subtle at first, a suggestion here, an interpretation there, small compromises that seemed reasonable in the face of the knowledge to be gained. Rao's natural talents had made him susceptible to promises of greater understanding, and his position as leader of the group had given weight to every decision he made on their behalf. Slowly, inexorably, the scholar's noble intentions had curdled into something altogether more malevolent. The man who had once sought to preserve the wisdom of the past began to see himself as architect of a new age, one in which the artificial barriers between the mortal realm and the burning hells would be cast down in favor of a more honest acknowledgement of humanity's true nature. Now Rao dwelt in a tower of black stone that rose from the shores of Gea Kul like an accusing finger pointed at the sky. His flesh had taken on the translucent quality of one touched by powers beyond the material world, blue veins pulsing beneath skin that seemed to glow with its own cold light. The eyes that had once sparkled with scholarly enthusiasm now burned with fires borrowed from the depths of hell itself. From his tower, the thing that had once been Gareth Rao commanded an ever-growing host of creatures that should not have walked beneath the sun. The feeders moved through Gea Kul's streets like pale ghosts, their crab-like forms shifting between dimensions as they sought fresh sources of the life energy that sustained them. The townspeople who had not fled cowered in their homes, afraid to venture forth lest they draw the attention of things that hunted by scent of fear and desperation. Beneath the settlement itself lay secrets older than the corruption that now tainted its streets. The forgotten battlefield of Al-Kut stretched through caverns carved from living rock, where thousands of fallen sorcerers from the ancient mage clan wars slumbered in uneasy death. These warriors had perished in conflicts so terrible that the very earth remembered their agony, their bones ground to dust by forces that had reshaped the geography of entire regions. The resurrection of Al-Kut's buried army would provide Belial with legions sufficient to drown the eastern kingdoms in shadow and flame. Each fallen mage retained echoes of the power that had made them formidable in life. And properly directed, their combined might could tear holes in reality itself, large enough for the armies of hell to pour through unimpeded. Time pressed forward, with the relentless certainty of falling sand. Ancient prophecies spoke of 5 days before hell would surge forth to claim the mortal realm in earnest, and already the first stirrings of that invasion could be felt by those sensitive to such emanations. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent intent, and strange lights danced on the horizon where no earthly fires burned. Deckard Cain had come to Caldeum following portents and visions that spoke of surviving Horadrim in distant lands, carried by dreams that showed him fragments of texts written in familiar hands and the faces of men who bore the bearing of true scholars. The journey from his temporary refuge had been long and fraught with perils both mundane and supernatural, but the promise of finding others who carried the flame of ancient wisdom had driven him forward, despite the protests of his aging frame. He had hoped to find Gillian and young Leah well settled in their new life, far from the horrors that had claimed Tristram and scattered its survivors like leaves before a hurricane. His memories of the former barmaid were fond ones. She had possessed a warmth and vitality that could brighten even the darkest tavern, a gift for making strangers feel welcome that had served her well in those troubled times. The reality he discovered upon arriving at their modest dwelling struck him like a physical blow. The woman who opened the door bore only the faintest resemblance to the Gillian he remembered. Age had claimed her youth with cruel efficiency, turning smooth skin to parchment and bright eyes to hollow shadows. Her hair, once lustrous brown, had faded to the color of winter grass, brittle and thin as spider silk. More troubling than the physical changes was the aura of neglect that surrounded her, the sense that she moved through her days like a sleepwalker navigating a landscape of half-remembered nightmares. When she spoke, her words carried an odd cadence, as if she were listening to voices only she could hear and struggling to sort her own thoughts from the whispers that filled her mind. The protective spells that Adria had woven around the dwelling years before still held, though their power had begun to fade like paint left too long in sunlight. Cain had found them only because he knew precisely where to look, following threads of power too subtle for casual observation to detect. Yet even those ancient wards could not shield the inhabitants from the slow erosion of sanity that came from living too close to forces beyond mortal comprehension. Young Leah proved a study in contrasts, physically frail yet possessed of an inner strength that manifested in moments of crisis, innocent of the world's true nature, yet somehow aware that the shadows held more than mere absence of light. The child moved through their cramped quarters with the unconscious grace of a dancer, always alert to the shifting moods of the woman who cared for her. When Cain looked upon the girl, he saw echoes of her true heritage written in the delicate architecture of her bones, in the way her dark eyes seemed to reflect depths that should not have existed in one so young. Power slumbered within her bloodline, inherited from both parents, though she knew nothing of either's true nature. The witch Adria's magical gifts flowed in her veins alongside something darker and more complex, the legacy of one who had served as vessel for Diablo himself. The crisis came in the depths of night, when Caldeum lay wrapped in slumber and even the ever-present sounds of commerce had faded to whispers. Cain had taken shelter in the dwelling's main room, his old bones grateful for the rough comfort of a pallet near the fireplace. Sleep had been slow to claim him, his mind too full of questions and half-formed plans to find the rest his body craved. The sound of movement in the hall drew his attention. Soft footsteps that spoke of someone trying to remain unnoticed, the whisper of fabric against skin as a figure moved with careful purpose through the darkness. At first he assumed it was merely Gillian attending to some household need, but something in the quality of the silence that followed made him rise from his makeshift bed and investigate. What he found in Leah's chamber would haunt his dreams for years to come. Gillian stood at the foot of the child's bed, her face utterly blank in the moonlight that filtered through the window. In her hand she held a kitchen knife, its blade gleaming with cold purpose as she swayed slightly from side to side like a tree in an unfelt breeze. The words she whispered were fragments of prophecy and madness, speaking of corruption that wore innocent faces and evil that grew stronger with each passing hour. She spoke of voices that commanded her to act before it was too late. Of visions that showed her what would happen if she failed to find the courage to do what was necessary. When Leah stirred in her sleep, turning to face the figure that loomed over her, the spell of contemplation broke. Gillian raised the knife with hands that trembled yet held steady purpose, her face transformed by a terrible resolve that spoke of minds pushed beyond their breaking point. Yet as the blade descended toward the sleeping child, something extraordinary occurred. Power erupted from Leah without conscious direction or control, a barrier of pure energy that turned aside the knife and sent Gillian stumbling backward with a cry of shock and confusion. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat and light, charged with forces that made the hair stand on end and set teeth on edge. The magical surge lasted only moments, but its effects lingered in the form of burns along the knife's edge and the acrid scent of power discharge that hung in the air like incense. Gillian collapsed to the floor, as if the strings that had held her upright had been severed. Her breathing, shallow and rapid as consciousness, fled from eyes that had seen too much. Cain gathered the unconscious woman in his arms, noting how light she had become, as if the madness had burned away everything substantial and left only the outer shell behind. He carried her to her own chamber and secured the door, then returned to check on Leah, who slept on as if nothing had disturbed her rest. The child's pulse remained strong and steady, her face serene in the moonlight that painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. Yet Cain could still feel the echo of power that had protected her, a resonance that spoke of abilities far beyond those of a normal child. The defensive magic had manifested without training or conscious intent, suggesting depths of potential that would require careful guidance to develop safely. As dawn broke over Caldeum's copper domes, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Deckard Cain sat beside the sleeping girl and contemplated the weight of responsibility that had settled upon his shoulders. In her blood flowed the legacy of both witch and wanderer, power that could either save Sanctuary or damn it, depending upon how it was shaped and directed. The morning brought with it a clarity of purpose that had been lacking the night before. Gillian's attack, born of madness though it was, had revealed truths that could no longer be ignored. The child possessed abilities that would draw the attention of forces both light and dark. And her safety lay not in hiding but in understanding the nature of what moved within her. The decision to leave Caldeum came not from any sudden revelation, but from the steady accumulation of signs that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Strange dreams plagued Cain's sleep, showing him visions of texts written in familiar hands, and the faces of men who bore the unmistakable bearing of true scholars. The very air seemed to whisper of journeys that must be undertaken, of knowledge that waited to be discovered in distant places. Leah accepted the prospect of departure with the resilience that had become her hallmark, though Cain could see the questions in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. The child understood that their circumstances had changed in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. That the attack in the night had marked a turning point from which there could be no return. The road that led away from Caldeum stretched across landscapes that spoke of both beauty and desolation, past monuments to forgotten civilizations and the bleached bones of creatures that had perished in conflicts too ancient for living memory to recall. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, while distant mountains rose like the spines of sleeping giants against a sky the color of hammered copper. Their path took them through wind-swept plains where hardy grass grew in scattered patches, past rock formations that had been carved by wind and time into shapes that resembled sleeping gods or the ruins of temples built to honor powers best left unnamed. The skeleton of some massive creature, its bones bleached white by countless seasons of sun and storm, served as a landmark visible for miles in any direction. As they climbed toward higher ground, Leah paused on an outcropping of stone and looked back toward the city that had been her home for all of her 8 years. Tears glittered in her eyes like captured starlight, reflecting the play of light across Caldeum's waterfalls and copper domes. The sight struck Cain with unexpected force, reminding him of his own departure from Tristram so many years before, when youth and certainty had made the world seem larger and more forgiving than experience would later prove it to be. The girl's grief was complicated by understanding beyond her years, an awareness that the place she was leaving had never truly felt like home, despite being the only one she had known. The narrow streets and shadowed alleys held memories of fear as much as comfort, of times when she had learned to make herself small and quiet to avoid drawing attention from those whose moods shifted like weather across mountain peaks. Their journey took them through territories where the influence of recent conflicts could still be felt in ruined settlements and roads left to decay from lack of maintenance. They passed merchant caravans guarded by men whose eyes held the wariness of those who had seen too much of the world's darker aspects, and pilgrims traveling to distant shrines in search of answers to questions that had no easy solutions. As evening approached on their second day of travel, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark thoughts made manifest. The air grew thick with the promise of rain and the electric tension that preceded dramatic weather. In the distance, lightning flickered between cloud banks, illuminating their edges with brief moments of silver fire. It was then that they encountered the first of many signs that their journey would prove more perilous than even Cain's cautious nature had anticipated. A mist began to rise from the ground, despite the absence of any nearby water source, creeping across the landscape with unnatural persistence and purpose. Within its grey embrace, shapes moved that defied easy categorization, neither fully solid nor entirely ephemeral, but something that existed in the spaces between such distinctions. The road ahead disappeared into the swirling fog as if the path itself had been consumed by the strange phenomenon. Left with little choice, they pressed forward into the embrace of the mist, guided more by instinct than sight, as the world around them transformed into something altogether more mysterious and threatening. Sounds reached them from within the grey veil, the clip-clop of hooves on stone, the creak of wagon wheels, and voices calling out in greeting. As the mist began to thin, they found themselves approaching a settlement that seemed to have materialized from the very air itself. Its buildings solid and permanent despite their sudden appearance. The town that emerged from the dissipating mist bore all the outward signs of prosperity and welcome hospitality, its streets clean and well-maintained, its buildings constructed with the care of craftsmen who took pride in their work, lanterns hung from posts at regular intervals, casting pools of warm light that should have been comforting but somehow felt more like the eyes of watchful predators. The inhabitants who emerged to greet them wore expressions of polite interest, their smiles exactly wide enough to convey friendliness without betraying any deeper emotion. They moved with the coordinated precision of players in a carefully rehearsed drama. Each gesture calculated to reinforce the impression of a community at peace with itself and the world. Lord Brand himself proved to be a figure of imposing height and unsettling proportions, his limbs seeming too long for his torso and his smile stretching just a bit wider than human anatomy should have allowed. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of one accustomed to command. Yet there was something in his cadence that suggested words chosen with care to conceal as much as they revealed. The nobleman's offer of hospitality came with all the proper forms of courtesy, yet Leah shrank closer to Cain's side as they were escorted through streets where windows remained dark, despite the evidence of life within. The child's instincts, sharpened by years of living with Gillian's unpredictable moods, detected undercurrents that adult reasoning might have dismissed as mere unfamiliarity. The feast that Lord Brand provided proved sumptuous beyond reasonable expectation for a settlement that had appeared so suddenly from the mist. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes that should have required days of preparation, while wines flowed from bottles that bore labels suggesting origins in regions hundreds of miles distant. The very abundance of the spread raised questions about supply lines and storage facilities that the Lord seemed disinclined to address. As the evening progressed, the townspeople gathered to listen as their leader spoke of travelers and the importance of proper hospitality to those who journeyed far from home. His words carried undertones that suggested meanings beyond their surface content, references to masters and obligations that painted a picture of loyalties extending far beyond the boundaries of the visible settlement. The rooms provided for their overnight stay bore the signs of careful preparation, with linens that smelled of lavender and furniture that showed no signs of wear despite the town's apparent remoteness. Yet, something in the very perfection of the arrangements felt wrong, as if the entire place had been constructed as a stage set rather than grown organically from the needs of a functioning community. Sleep came uneasily to both travelers, though for different reasons. Leah found herself plagued by dreams that seemed more vivid than waking consciousness, visions of shapes moving through darkness and voices, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The child's unconscious mind detected threats that her rational thoughts could not yet articulate, setting off alarms that manifested as restless tossing and half-remembered nightmares. Cain's rest was disturbed by more concrete concerns, the sound of movement in the walls, as if the building itself contained passages and chambers that did not appear on any visible blueprint. Occasionally he caught glimpses of light beneath his door that moved with purpose, rather than following the random patterns of night watchmen or restless residents. The revelation of the town's true nature came in the hours before dawn, when exhaustion had finally begun to claim both travelers despite their unease. Tendrils of shadow crept across the floor of Leah's chamber, like living vines, reaching toward the sleeping child with deliberate intent. The same unnatural darkness began to seep through cracks in the walls of Cain's room, carrying with it the scent of decay and the whisper of voices, speaking words of binding and capture. Only the intervention of an unexpected ally prevented the trap from closing completely around them. A figure moved through the building with the silent grace of one trained in the arts of war, dispatching the shadow creatures with weapons that gleamed with their own inner light. The monk who revealed himself as their rescuer bore the unmistakable bearing of the Ivgorod brotherhood, his movements flowing with the controlled power of one who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of physical and spiritual perfection. Mikulov, for that was the name he gave as he led them through passages that seemed to exist in the spaces between the building's visible architecture, spoke in urgent whispers of visions and prophecies that had brought him across vast distances to this precise moment and location. The gods of his homeland had shown him fragments of what was to come, visions of darkness spreading across the land, and of key figures whose actions would determine whether light or shadow claimed dominion over the mortal realm. Their escape from Lord Brand's domain proved harrowing in ways that had little to do with physical danger, and everything to do with the gradual revelation of how completely they had been deceived. The town's apparent prosperity dissolved like morning mist as they fled through its streets, revealing structures that were little more than facades painted to suggest solidity, while concealing empty spaces behind. The inhabitants they had taken for ordinary townsfolk showed their true nature as the deception crumbled, their forms shifting and flowing like water given temporary shape through will alone. Gray skin took on the pallor of things that had never known sunlight, while eyes that had seemed merely distant revealed themselves to be empty sockets that gazed into realms beyond the material world. As they reached the settlement's outskirts, Lord Brand's voice echoed after them with words that spoke of masters and obligations, of purposes that transcended the petty concerns of individual survival. His laughter followed them into the wilderness beyond, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in unnatural harmony. The road that led away from the phantom settlements stretched across landscapes that bore no resemblance to the terrain they had traversed the day before, as if their escape had carried them into an entirely different region without regard for the normal rules of geography. Behind them, the mist rose once more to swallow all evidence that the town had ever existed, leaving only memories that felt increasingly dreamlike with each passing hour. In the hills beyond Kurast, where ancient stones bore witness to conflicts that had shaped the very geography of the region, they found the remnants of what had once been a proud brotherhood, united in pursuit of wisdom and truth. The first ones, as they had styled themselves in days when hope still seemed a reasonable companion, now dwelt in caves like beaten animals seeking shelter from storms too fierce to weather in the open. The discovery of their hiding place came through careful observation rather than direct guidance, as Aegil emerged from passages carved in living rock to greet travelers whose arrival had been foretold in texts older than the memory of any living scholar. The young man's appearance spoke of hardships endured and ideals compromised, his pale features bearing the marks of one who had looked upon truths too terrible for unprepared minds to encompass. The scholar, who introduced himself as a member of the surviving order, bore little resemblance to the confident academics who had once gathered in Gea Kul's hidden chambers to study texts that promised insights into the fundamental nature of reality itself. His white hair and colorless eyes gave him an ethereal quality, as if the experiences he had endured had begun to burn away everything that tied him to the material world. The tunnels through which Aegil led them spoke of engineering projects undertaken by civilizations whose names had been forgotten before the first human settlements took root in the region. Carved passages wound through the earth with purpose and precision, their walls bearing symbols that predated any known system of writing while somehow conveying meanings that registered on levels deeper than conscious thought. Within these hidden ways, the surviving members of the first ones had established a refuge that served their immediate needs while falling far short of the grand vision that had originally drawn them together. The caves provided shelter from the predators that hunted through Gea Kul's streets, but they also served as constant reminders of how far the Brotherhood had fallen from its original aspirations. Thomas and Cullen, Lund, and the handful of others who remained bore the hollow-eyed expression of men who had witnessed the corruption of everything they had once held sacred. Their leader's transformation from inspiring teacher to puppet of demonic influence had shattered their faith, not only in Gareth Rao, but in their own ability to distinguish between wisdom and deception. The texts they had salvaged from their former meeting places told a story of gradual corruption that had begun with the best of intentions and proceeded through compromises so small that none had recognized the danger until it was far too late to reverse course. Rao's enthusiasm for their discoveries had proved infectious, his vision of a renewed Horadrim compelling enough to override the caution that should have guided their approach to powers beyond mortal comprehension. As Cain listened to their accounts of how noble purpose had been perverted into malevolent design, he found himself reflecting on the narrow margin that separated dedication from obsession, knowledge from corruption. The scholars who had discovered the hidden cache of Horadric texts had approached their studies with reverence and careful methodology. Yet somehow they had been led step by step down a path that ended in nightmare. The books that remained to them represented only a fraction of the library they had once possessed, salvaged from ruins that now crawled with creatures that defied rational categorization. The unburied, as the survivors called them, appeared to be amalgamations of corpses and landscape, given mockery of life through forces that drew their power from realms where normal rules held no sway. These abominations moved through the passages beneath Gea Kul with purpose that suggested intelligence behind their creation, hunting for sources of life energy to sustain their unnatural existence. The very stones seemed to recoil from their presence, while the air itself grew thick with the stench of decay whenever they passed nearby. Egel's account of his recent venture into the abandoned Horadrim chambers painted a picture of sanctuary transformed into charnel house, of knowledge preserved for centuries reduced to ash and corruption in the space of a few terrible months. The young scholar's voice carried the flat tone of one who had accepted that the world contained more horrors than any single mind could hope to process. Yet even in the depths of their despair, the surviving First Ones had not entirely abandoned the principles that had drawn them together in the first place. Hidden among the salvaged texts were prophecies that spoke of a time when the last of the true Horadrim would seek them out, bringing with him the knowledge and authority necessary to stand against the forces that threatened to consume everything they had worked to preserve. The discovery that Deckard Cain had indeed come to them, carrying with him not only the wisdom of ages, but also a child whose bloodline connected her to powers that could reshape the balance between light and darkness, brought the first glimmers of hope they had known since their world collapsed around them. As the old scholar examined the texts they had preserved, his experienced eye quickly identified passages that spoke of events yet to come, references to battles that would determine the fate of not just Gea Kul, but the entire eastern region of Sanctuary. The prophecies painted a picture of conflict on a scale that would dwarf the Mage clan wars, with consequences that would echo across generations. The surviving members of the Order listened as Cain shared his own knowledge of the forces arrayed against them, his account of recent events placing their local catastrophe within the context of a much larger struggle between powers that viewed the mortal realm as nothing more than a battlefield upon which to settle ancient grudges. Slowly, carefully, like men emerging from a cave into sunlight after months of darkness, the First Ones began to remember what it felt like to believe that their actions might matter, that knowledge and determination could triumph over ignorance and malice, even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against them. The decision to return to Gea Kul, to venture once more into the heart of the corruption that had destroyed everything they had built, came not from desperate recklessness, but from the calculated recognition that retreat was no longer a viable option. The forces gathering beneath the coastal settlement would not be content to remain within the boundaries they currently occupied. They would spread like plague across the countryside until nothing remained untainted by their influence. The journey back to Gea Kul carried them through landscapes that bore increasingly obvious signs of supernatural taint, where the very grass seemed to wither beneath an unseen blight, and the air grew thick with vapors that stung the eyes and throat. Even the hardiest vegetation showed signs of distress, leaves curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from influences that attacked at levels deeper than mere physical contact. The coastal settlement itself had undergone a transformation that spoke of corruption, accelerating beyond any natural rate of decay. Buildings that had stood for generations showed signs of structural damage that suggested the foundations of reality itself were being undermined by forces that operated according to rules antithetical to the normal order of existence. Strange lights danced on the horizon where no earthly fires should have burned, while the very air seemed to pulse with rhythms that echoed no mortal heartbeat. The harbor that had once served fishing vessels and trading ships now hosted creatures that had never known sunlight, their forms shifting between states of matter as they went about purposes that defied rational understanding. From his tower of black stone, Gareth Rao presided over the growing chaos with the satisfaction of one who had finally found his true calling. The corruption that flowed through his veins had long since burned away any trace of the man he had once been, leaving behind something that retained memory of scholarship, but served only the will of powers that delighted in the perversion of noble intentions. The decision to make use of the tunnel network that connected various points throughout the settlement and the surrounding countryside required a level of desperate courage that few would have possessed under normal circumstances. Yet, as Cain studied the maps that the surviving first ones had preserved, he began to see how the very passages that Rao's forces used for movement and communication could be turned against them. The ancient engineering that had carved these ways through solid rock spoke of purposes that remained mysterious, despite centuries of study by the region's scholars. Some theories suggested they had been created as escape routes during the mage-clan wars, while others proposed they represented attempts to tap into ley lines of power that ran beneath the earth like underground rivers of pure energy. The books of Vizieri magic that Egil had salvaged from the ruined library represented knowledge that any true scholar of the Horadrim tradition would normally have refused to touch under any circumstances. The demon-summoning texts contained power that came at prices too terrible for most minds to contemplate, yet their insights into the fundamental forces that shaped reality made them invaluable tools for those desperate enough to risk their souls in service of a greater cause. As Cain opened the first of these forbidden volumes, he felt the weight of compromise settling upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from shadows and regret. Every incantation he studied opened doorways in his soul that perhaps should have remained forever sealed. Yet the alternatives, allowing Rao's plans to proceed unchecked, watching as the Eastern kingdoms fell to forces that would show no mercy to innocence or age, seemed far worse than any personal cost he might be asked to pay. The reveal spell that he finally selected from among the grimoire's terrible offerings carried risks that extended far beyond the immediate danger of detection by their enemies. The magic would announce their presence to every supernatural entity within hundreds of miles, drawing attention from creatures whose interest in mortal affairs rarely ended well for those who attracted their notice. Yet without the spell's power to pierce the veils of concealment that shrouded Rao's operations, they would be fighting blindly against forces whose true nature and extent remained hidden. The gamble represented their best hope of gaining the knowledge necessary to strike effectively at the heart of the corruption before it could spread beyond all possibility of containment. The incantation itself proved simpler than Cain had expected, its words flowing from his lips with an ease that spoke of how naturally the forces involved responded to properly trained will. Yet, as the spell took effect, he felt the gaze of thousands turning to focus on Gea Kul, senses belonging to things that dwelt in caverns, stinking of rot and blood, abominations that hid in the spaces between dimensions where normal rules held no authority. The Horadrim symbol that blazed to life on the side of one of the settlement's larger buildings burned with light that carried its own heat, revealing the entrance to chambers that had remained hidden for decades beneath layers of concealment, both magical and mundane. Yet even as the revelation provided them with the information they sought, it also announced to their enemies that the game had entered a new phase. From his tower by the sea, the thing that had once been Gareth Rao felt the disruption like a physical blow, the carefully maintained illusions that protected his operations flickering like candle flames in hurricane winds. His howl of rage and frustration echoed across the settlement with volume that shattered windows and sent lesser creatures scurrying for shelter. The race that followed would be measured not in hours, but in minutes, as forces that had been content to work in shadow suddenly found themselves exposed to scrutiny they could not afford. The underground passages that had served as highways for creatures of darkness became hunting grounds where predator and prey exchanged roles with deadly frequency. As they descended into the tunnels beneath Gea Kul, following routes that the first ones knew from memory despite the changes that corruption had wrought upon familiar landmarks, Cain could feel the weight of ancient stones pressing down upon them like the accumulated sins of civilizations long forgotten. Each step carried them deeper into a realm where the normal rules of existence held increasingly tenuous sway. The passages themselves told stories written in stone and shadow, their walls bearing marks that spoke of conflicts fierce enough to reshape the very architecture of the underground network. Claw marks scored the rock, where creatures too large for the confined spaces had somehow forced their passage, while areas of melted stone suggested temperatures that should have been impossible to achieve without industrial equipment. Deeper they went, following paths that seemed to exist in defiance of normal geometry, until they reached chambers that opened into spaces far larger than the settlement above could have contained. Here, in caverns carved from living rock by forces that predated human civilization, lay the true heart of the corruption that threatened to consume not just Gea Kul, but the entire eastern region of Sanctuary. The Horadrim library that the first ones had established in their days of innocence and hope now served as a mockery of its original purpose, its carefully organized collections replaced by texts that spoke of powers no mortal mind should have been asked to comprehend. Yet among the corrupted volumes, traces remained of the scholarship that had once flourished in these chambers. It was here, in the ruins of their former sanctuary, that the surviving members of the Order would make their stand against the forces that had destroyed everything they had worked to build. The knowledge preserved in these chambers might yet provide the key to undoing the damage that had been wrought, if they could find the courage to risk everything on one final gamble against impossible odds. Within the black tower that rose from Gea Kul's shore like an accusation against the sky, Gareth Rao waited with the patience of one who had transcended the normal limitations of mortal existence. The corruption that flowed through his veins had granted him perspectives that stretched across dimensions and timescales, allowing him to perceive the approach of his enemies as clearly as if they walked in broad daylight across open ground. The man who had once devoted his life to the preservation and interpretation of ancient wisdom now existed as something that retained memory of scholarship but served only the will of Belial, the Lord of Lies. His flesh had taken on qualities that spoke of transformation beyond mere physical alteration. Skin that seemed to glow with its own cold light, veins that pulsed with energies borrowed from realms where different laws governed the relationship between matter and spirit. As Cain and his companions made their way through the passages beneath the settlement, following routes that the surviving First Ones knew from memory despite the changes that darkness had wrought upon familiar landmarks. They found themselves walking into a web of deception that had been decades in the weaving. The texts that Egil had discovered in the abandoned Horadrim chambers told only part of a story that stretched back to the very foundations of the order they had sought to rebuild. Every step of their journey, from the initial discovery of the hidden cache of ancient writings to Cain's arrival in response to their desperate need, had been anticipated and prepared for by intelligences that viewed mortal affairs as nothing more than elaborate games played for their own amusement. The Vidgeri spellbook that Cain carried with him contained knowledge that had been deliberately placed in his path, its pages filled with incantations that would serve Belial's purposes regardless of how they were employed. The very act of using demon-summoning magic had opened channels of communication that allowed the Lord of Lies to whisper directly into the scholar's mind, planting suggestions and interpretations that seemed to arise from his own careful reasoning. The revelation came in stages, each new understanding adding weight to the growing realization that they had been dancing to melodies composed by their enemies from the very beginning. The prophecies that had guided Cain's steps across the breadth of sanctuary bore the subtle fingerprints of intelligences that delighted in the corruption of hope, while the visions that had driven Mikulov from his homeland contained threads of truth, woven through with deceptions, designed to ensure his arrival at precisely the right moment. Even Leah's presence served purposes beyond her role as innocent victim requiring protection. The child's bloodline connected her to powers that could be channeled and directed by those who understood the proper techniques. Her unconscious, magical abilities providing a reservoir of energy that could fuel rituals of unimaginable scope and consequence. In the deepest chambers beneath Gea Kul, where the forgotten battlefield of Alcut stretched through caverns carved from living rock, thousands of fallen sorcerers from the ancient mage clan wars waited in death for the call that would summon them back to a semblance of life. These warriors had perished in conflicts so terrible that the very earth remembered their agony, their bones ground to dust by forces that had reshaped entire regions in the space of hours. The resurrection rituals that Rao had been perfecting required components that could only be obtained through the willing sacrifice of those who carried the blood of heroes in their veins. The corruption of the First Ones had provided him with scholars whose knowledge made them valuable beyond mere physical contribution, while Cain's arrival brought to his grasp the last living link to the original Horadrim brotherhood. The confrontation that had been building since the moment Cain first set foot on the road to Gea Kul finally came to pass in chambers where the echoes of ancient power still lingered like ghosts, reluctant to abandon the scenes of their earthly triumphs. The air itself seemed thick with the weight of accumulated malevolence, charged with energies that made rational thought difficult and coherent action nearly impossible. Gareth Rao appeared before them not as conqueror but as educator, his transformed features wearing expressions of patient condescension, as he explained how thoroughly they had been deceived. The scholar who had once inspired young academics with his vision of renewed Horadrim now took obvious pleasure in detailing the manner in which their noble intentions had been turned against them. The thing that spoke with Rao's voice painted a picture of manipulation that stretched back generations, of carefully planted texts and strategically timed discoveries that had guided the development of human civilization along paths that served demonic purposes. The Horadrim themselves, for all their genuine dedication to the cause of protecting sanctuary from supernatural threats, had unknowingly served as agents of the very forces they sought to oppose. When Belial's influence seized upon Egil's form, using the young scholar as a vessel through which to communicate more directly with their enemies, the true scope of the deception became clear. The demon's words carried weight that went beyond mere intimidation, revealing knowledge of events and connections that painted the entirety of recent history as an elaborate trap designed to ensnare the last representatives of organized resistance to Hell's dominion over the mortal realm. The psychological torment that followed proved more devastating than any physical assault could have been. Through Egil's possessed form, Belial conjured visions of Cain's long-dead wife Amelia and son Jared, revealing that their deaths upon the road to Caldeum decades earlier had been no mere bandit attack, but calculated cruelty designed to break his spirit and drive him toward the very obsessions that had ultimately led him to this moment. The images that danced before his eyes showed scenes of suffering that had haunted his dreams for 35 years. But now they carried new details that spoke of deliberate torture, inflicted not for material gain, but purely for the pleasure of causing pain. The bandits who had slaughtered his family had worn the faces of ordinary criminals, but their eyes had held the glow of possession, their movements coordinated by intelligences that found amusement in the destruction of innocence. As the demon's laughter filled the chamber with sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, Cain felt the careful walls he had built around these memories beginning to crumble. The guilt that he had carried for decades, the sense that his neglect of family responsibilities had somehow contributed to their deaths, suddenly seemed justified by revelations that placed the blame for their suffering squarely upon his shoulders. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, salvation came from an unexpected source. Mikulov's punch dagger found its mark with precision born of years of training, severing Belial's hold upon the possessed scholar in a single clean stroke that sent the demon's essence shrieking back to whatever realm had spawned it. The monk's face showed no trace of satisfaction as he withdrew his weapon from the base of Egil's skull, his expression bearing instead the weight of one who had been forced to destroy something precious in order to prevent greater tragedy. The young scholar's death served as brutal reminder that victory against such forces always came at prices that no mortal should have been asked to pay. As the green light that had bathed the chamber began to fade into ordinary darkness, Cain found himself holding the lifeless form of one who had trusted him enough to follow him into the depths of corruption itself. The sacrifice demanded recognition, a promise that the knowledge and courage that had brought them this far would not be wasted on half measures or comfortable compromises. The staff that had served as symbol of his authority and connection to the ancient order lay in pieces around them, shattered during the confrontation with forces that treated material objects as mere inconveniences to be swept aside. Yet even broken, the weapon retained enough of its original power to serve one final purpose. Not as tool of combat, but as focus for energies that could still make a difference in the outcome of their struggle. In the aftermath of Belial's defeat, the chambers beneath Gea Kul fell into a silence that seemed to echo with the ghosts of words that could never be unsaid and choices that could never be unmade. The green light that had suffused the air during the demon's manifestation faded gradually, leaving behind only the ordinary illumination of torches that flickered with mortal flame and cast shadows that behaved according to natural laws. Egil's body lay where it had fallen, his pale features finally at peace after months of struggling against influences that had slowly eaten away at everything that made him human. The young scholar's sacrifice had broken Belial's hold upon the material world. But the victory had come at a cost that would haunt the survivors for whatever time remained to them. As Cain knelt beside the fallen member of the First Ones, he found himself thinking of all the other young men who had paid similar prices in the endless struggle between light and darkness. Egil had possessed the curiosity and dedication that should have led to a long life spent in peaceful study, surrounded by books and colleagues who shared his passion for knowledge. Instead, he had become another casualty in a war that consumed the innocent along with the guilty. The pieces of Cain's shattered staff lay scattered across the chamber floor, their polished surfaces reflecting torchlight in fragments that seemed to hold echoes of the power they had once channeled. The weapon had served him faithfully for decades, its familiar way to comfort during the darkest hours of his long journey across Sanctuary's troubled lands. Now it lay broken like so much else that had once seemed permanent and reliable. Yet even in destruction, the staff retained enough of its original purpose to serve one final function. As Cain gathered the fragments with trembling hands, he felt the familiar tingle of power that spoke of energies waiting to be directed toward worthy ends. The symbols carved into its surface still glowed faintly, their meaning unchanged despite the physical damage that had rendered the weapon unusable as a tool of combat. The binding spell that he wove around the broken pieces drew upon every scrap of lore he had accumulated across a lifetime of study, combining techniques from traditions that had rarely found common ground in their approach to the fundamental forces of creation. Horadric knowledge merged with insights gleaned from texts that should never have been opened, while power borrowed from realms of shadow served purposes that would have horrified their original sources. The incantation that flowed from his lips carried weight that went far beyond the physical reconstruction of a damaged object. Each word served as link in a chain that connected past to future, binding the sacrifice of those who had fallen to the hope of those who might yet be saved. The staff became symbol rather than mere tool, representing the unbroken continuity of purpose that stretched from the first Horadrim to whatever new order might rise from the ashes of their current struggle. As the fragments fused back together under the influence of forces that transcended normal understanding of matter and energy, the weapon took on qualities that had not been present in its original form. The wood seemed to pulse with life, that spoke of trees that had grown in sacred groves, while the metal fittings gleamed with light, borrowed from stars that shone over realms where different laws governed the relationship between hope and reality. The surviving members of the First Ones gathered around their makeshift leader as he rose to his feet, the restored staff crackling with energies that made the air itself shimmer with heat and possibility. Thomas and Colin, Lund, and the handful of others who remained bore expressions that spoke of men who had remembered what it felt like to believe in something larger than their own immediate survival. The knowledge they had preserved through months of hiding and desperation suddenly seemed more valuable than any treasure that could have been measured in gold or precious stones. The texts that contained fragments of Horadric wisdom, the maps that detailed the underground passages beneath Gea Kul, the hard-won understanding of how corruption spread and how it might be contained. All of these represented resources that could make the difference between victory and defeat in the struggles yet to come. Mikulov stood apart from the others, his face bearing the serene expression of one who had found peace, despite the violence he had been forced to commit. The monk's gods had not abandoned him after all, lending strength to mortal arms in the hour of greatest need. The tattoo of Itar that decorated his back seemed to move with its own inner fire, while his eyes held depths that reflected wisdom earned through trial rather than mere study. The plan that took shape in the flickering torchlight drew upon every resource they possessed, combining the scholar's intimate knowledge of Gea Kul's hidden ways with the monk's tactical expertise, and Cain's understanding of the forces they faced. The tower that rose from the settlement's shore like an accusation against the sky would become tomb rather than fortress, its master's ambitions buried beneath stones that would remember their purpose long after the last witness to these events had passed into history. The seals that contained Al-Qut's buried army would hold against the darkness that sought to wake them, reinforced by power drawn from sources that Belial could never have anticipated. The ancient battlefield would remain inviolate, its fallen warriors continuing their eternal sleep, while the living world above went about the business of healing and growth. Young Leah, witness to horrors that would have broken lesser spirits, emerged from the depths with understanding of the power that flowed within her blood. The child's abilities, once source of fear and confusion, now seemed like gifts that could serve the cause of protection rather than destruction. Under proper guidance, the magic she carried could become shield rather than sword, bulwark against the forces that sought to prey upon the innocent. The journey back to the surface carried them through passages that seemed somehow cleaner than they had during the descent, as if the very stones had been purged of the taint that had poisoned them. The air moved with natural currents once more, while the oppressive weight that had pressed down upon them lifted like fog before the morning sun. Behind them, the tower by the sea stood empty and silent, its windows dark and its chambers echoing with nothing more threatening than the sound of waves breaking against stone. The corruption that had transformed Gareth Rao into something that served only darkness had been burned away by forces that left no trace of his passing, save memories that would serve as warning to future generations. The road that led away from Gea Kul stretched across landscapes that showed the first signs of healing, where grass had begun to grow green once more, and the air carried scents of salt and growing things rather than decay and despair. In the distance, mountains rose like promises of lands beyond the reach of corruption, while overhead the stars wheeled in patterns that spoke of order restored and balances maintained. The surviving members of the first ones would scatter to the four winds, carrying with them knowledge and purpose that would serve as foundation for whatever new order might rise from the ashes of their broken brotherhood. Some would return to their former lives, while others would seek out new companions who shared their dedication to the preservation of wisdom and the protection of innocence. Deckard Cain, bearing the weight of all he had learned and lost, walked onward into whatever time remained to him. The staff that had been broken and reforged served as reminder that even the most fundamental damage could be healed if one possessed the courage to pay the necessary price. Behind lay ashes of the past. Ahead waited the possibility of redemption earned through sacrifice and service to something greater than self. The stars that shone down upon their small company held no warmth, yet somehow they seemed touched by the courage of those who refused to yield to despair. In the darkness between one heartbeat and the next, hope kindled like flame that no wind could extinguish, promising that light would endure even in the deepest shadows of a world that had known too much of sorrow and loss. Years would pass before the full significance of these events became clear to those who studied the patterns of history. The corruption that had threatened to consume the eastern kingdoms was contained, its spread halted by the sacrifice of those who understood that some victories could only be purchased with blood and suffering willingly given. In Caldeum's halls of learning, scholars would debate the nature of the forces that had been unleashed and conquered in the ruins of Gea Kul. The texts that survived the ordeal would be copied and preserved, their wisdom passed down to new generations who would face different challenges but draw upon the same well of courage and determination that had sustained their predecessors. The child who had walked into darkness as Leah would emerge as something more, not lost to the powers that flowed within her blood, but awakened to possibilities that transcended the narrow boundaries of fear and desperation. Under Cain's patient guidance, she would learn to see her abilities not as curse but as gift, tools that could serve the cause of protection rather than destruction. Mikulov would return to his mountain homeland, carrying with him stories of gods who had not abandoned their faithful despite the trials that tested mortal understanding. The monastery of Ivgorod would welcome back one who had proven that duty sometimes required venturing far from familiar paths, that service to the light demanded willingness to walk through shadows that would have consumed lesser spirits. The road that stretched ahead held perils and wonders in equal measure, challenges that would test the resolve of those who had survived this trial, and opportunities to build something better from the ruins of what had been lost. In the space between one breath and the next, between the ending of one story and the beginning of the next, hope persisted like starlight piercing the deepest night. The ancient words echoed in memory. Stay a while and listen, for in the sharing of stories lay the preservation of wisdom, and in the preservation of wisdom lay the promise that light would endure whatever darkness might yet come to test the courage of those who called sanctuary home.